Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of British and American Culture. I happened to bump into a couple of young ladies who are taking the class, some freshmen, and that's the only two people that I actually know from this class, but it was nice to say hello. I think we had better delay doing in-person classes considering hundreds of people are dying and hundreds of thousands of people are getting sick still. So I'm going to continue it's because this class has 55 students. My other classes are going to be switched to in-person in April, okay? So if you're in this class and you're also enrolled in a conversation class or a composition class, then I will see you in that class. But this class has 55 students and none of our rooms are big enough to really make it comfortable. Normally the capacity of the big rooms is around 100, but because of the social distancing that is necessary and the plastic shields, you know what I mean, we should wait a little bit longer for this class. And it's not like we can have a lot of active discussion between us when a class is this big. This is a lecture class, so hopefully you don't mind too much that I'm going to continue talking to you like this for a few more weeks. As soon as things start to get better, and it looks like we have gotten past the worst, although like I said, 400 people died yesterday. As you know, you're all young and healthy, so it's probably not going to hit you that hard. However, I don't want to get it. I haven't gotten it yet. I know other professors who have, so I don't want to be knocked out for 1 week or quarantined for a week either, and I don't want it to happen to any of you. So let's just keep going like this for a few more weeks and then we'll see. Like I said, if you're in one of my other classes, this will be the last week of online, then we'll switch. But this class will continue online, and as I said to you right at the beginning, Wednesday's class will be online the entire semester. That will never change. It'll just be Friday that we will do in-person classes. Okay, what's next? Quiz, not today, obviously. The quiz number 2 is next week, and it's the content from quiz 1. Nothing from before quiz 1, obviously. It's going to be on that, so you just have to know about the Middle Ages that I've been talking about. Today is going to be the 3rd lecture on that, and the last one was a long one, I know. And this one might be of similar length, I'm not sure. I'll try to make it shorter and sweeter, but no guarantees, obviously. I have a bunch of things on the board. I have to get through all these things. I'll leave some of the stuff to reading, but I also released the scores. So if you put in your email address correctly, then you got the results was released to you, okay? One student submitted a quiz twice. You can't do that because after you submit the first time, I've made it so that you can see the results. Now, I think I can change it so you can't see the results right away. I'll have to look at that. But anyway, the rule is submit the form once. There was one student that submitted twice, and I just delete the second form. The second form doesn't count. So whatever you get on the first form, that's it. You have 10 minutes maximum. Doesn't matter what any other timer says. At 11:10, it's over. So if you hand it in at 11:04 and then you hand in another one at 11:07, that second one, no matter what the score is, if it's higher or lower, that one's going to be deleted. Normally it's higher because you saw what the answers to the questions. So of course you can't submit twice. Just submit it once. That's your only chance. Those are the rules. Okay. Next thing, I did get an email from a student before the quiz, but I didn't answer the question at the time. It slipped my mind, for one, and there wasn't anything related to it on the quiz, so I didn't want to address it. But the question went something like this: why did Canute become the king of England if if the Danes, the Vikings were attacking and the English were at war with them, why did Canute become the king? Why did they want a Danish king? Well, that's a complicated question, but it also has to do with the timeline. When Alfred was king, the Danes were trying to conquer England and they failed. So I didn't tell you every little detail, but by the time Alfred, his reign was over, and then his son and his grandson became the kings of England, right, of the unified king of England, there was a deal. Northern England and Scotland was under Danish control. It was called the Danelaw. Now, I haven't shown you a picture of the map, but it's essentially, just imagine from basically north of Manchester, the parts of England, those northern kingdoms of England, there the Danes, the Vikings, were in control for 100 years. So Northern England and Scotland were heavily influenced by the Danish. In fact, there were many Danes living there. They moved, they colonized, and they intermarried with Scots and with English. So that's why I said I really want to go to Orkney. It's an island. There's these two islands that are very far north of Scotland, right up in the North Sea. They're very isolated. And Orkney and the Shetland Islands, they remained under Viking influence for 1,000 years. So you go there and you get like Scottish Viking culture, because they never really left up in the far north. And the Scottish didn't really have the ability to get rid of them. And, a lot of those people, even York, Northern English, that was essentially a Viking settlement. There was a lot of Danish people there. Dublin in Ireland was Viking and then Norman mixed. There's a lot of mixing of these people. So the short answer to that question is that there was a lot of cultural influence, legal influence, linguistic influence in England, so that there was a lot of support for Canute, because he wasn't a conqueror, he was invited. That's why they invited him. There's a lot of intermarrying. Even Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king, who loses to William at the Battle of Hastings and dies with an arrow in his eye, his family intermarries with the Danes, and the English title, Earl, is a Danish title, Jarl. Okay, so you've got these, basically after the Normans. This is why the Norman conquest is so important, is because you got the Germanic, and that's why I explain all this stuff to you, because the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes come in and they kind of dominate the culture and make this place called England. Before that, it was Roman Britannia, and before that, it was Celtic Britain. Right? And we don't have another name for it, but they were the Britons. So the Britons had the culture, and then transformed by the Romans, and then transformed by the Germans, and then transformed by the Vikings. And Canute really was the end. He was the end. He was the peak and the end of the influence of the Vikings. Hundreds of years of raiding, attacking, and settling. And then what happens when William takes over is instead of being the culture oriented towards Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, it pivots towards France. And for hundreds of years, England will be focused towards France, because half of their land, at one point, when Henry II takes over Ireland and is ruling essentially over, Ireland, England, Normandy, Aquitaine, Anjou, Poitiers. He's got northwestern France, which is that area is almost as big as England. That's why they call it the Angevin Empire sometimes. So that's why William conquering and killing Harold, who was connected to the Danes, even though he fought the Vikings, right? His brother Tostig was allied with the Vikings. His family was close to the people of Canute. So Canute dies, his children aren't capable of leading. The English kings don't want, England doesn't want a bad Viking king. So they have Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor dies and has no kids. So Harold becomes the king, right? And he's connected to Denmark because his father is an earl. And he's an earl, a jarl, and so is his brother. His brother doesn't like it, so he gets a Viking army together. Harold fights those Vikings, kills them all, and then he fights against William, who also thinks that he, because he's related on his mother's side, on his father's side, through his mother, through his great-great-grandmother. It's on the female side of the Anglo-Saxon line. He says he has a claim to the throne, not Harold. Harold has a claim to the throne because his father's a very powerful person, and they've been controlling England essentially for decades because Edward the Confessor wasn't a very strong king. William kills Harold, and then all of a sudden, everything's connected to France, and the connections between England and the Nordic countries weaken and basically disappear. That's the story. That was the short answer. Okay, great question. That's not on the quiz, that's from last quiz. So I hope that explains it, the whole picture a little bit clearer. Why is Canute around? Because in the 9th and 10th and 11th century, the Viking culture was more significant and more dominant in England than the Norman culture. And then after that, it completely changes. And then, gradually English transforms into a completely different language. That's why Old English is like Old Danish, not like Old French, because there's no real connection between English and French until the Norman conquest happens. That's why 1066 is the most important number in English history. Now, this looks intimidating. I know. This looks like a bunch of history, and it looks like history class. This is not history class. The numbers are just there to show you we're talking about the period, okay? Magna Carta is in the middle of the, it's the High Middle Ages, what they call the High Middle Ages, okay? And the Middle Ages are between the Roman period. Sometimes they call it the beginning, the Dark Ages, because Rome falls. There's the Dark Ages, and then there's the Middle Ages, and then there's the modern age, the Renaissance, and then the beginning of our period, the modern period. Are we postmodern now? Probably, but people really haven't gotten a good name for us yet. But it goes classic period, Roman, there's the Celtic pagan era, then there's the classical rule of the Romans in Europe, and then the fall of the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and hopefully by next lecture we'll be done the Middle Ages and into early modern, Renaissance, Shakespeare, Henry VIII period, okay? But anyway, this is right in the middle. When the Crusades are happening, King Richard dies, and King John, as I said, he was a horrible king. Everybody hated him. And so they got together and they forced him to sign this charter that legalized the rights. It's almost like a constitution that restricts the absolute power of the king and gives rights to people in terms of trials and taxation. It's mostly for wealthy people, but it's the beginning of giving more power to the people and restricting what the king is allowed to do. Technically, the king is chosen by, not technically, ostensibly, the king is chosen by God and is ruled by divine right. So what the king does is what God wants. So in that sense, the king can do whatever he wants. But this document says no, the king can't do whatever he wants. He is chosen by God, but he just can't be a maniac and a tyrant and do bad things to the kingdom. He's not allowed to do that. Okay, then I explained about the Great Famine and how everybody got sick and there was really bad weather. And in general, the weather had been very good before for several hundred years, from about the time of William the Conqueror, from around 1066 until the middle of the 13th century, the weather had been better than usual for several hundred years. They called it the long summer. If you watch Game of Thrones, they talk about that. They talk about it's the long summer, but winter is coming, right? So they keep saying all the time, especially at the beginning of the series, winter is coming. And this is what happened in real life. This is the Game of Thrones is actually based on a war that starts at the end of this. We will talk about that next lecture. But Game of Thrones is partially based on a historical event called the War of the Roses. That's for next class. This class, we have this famine going on, and simultaneously England is trying to subdue Scotland and make it, fold it into England as another kingdom that belongs to the English crown. Edward I basically wins the war, but the Scottish don't admit it, so they fight again. So there's a break here. They don't fight continuously for 50 years, but they fight a long series of battles and wars, and they're losing. But then Edward II, Edward I dies, and Edward II becomes the king, and he's not like his dad. He fails to defeat the Scots. I mean, there's some disastrous battles. It's in the movie Braveheart. If we get into the classroom, I'll show you some clips of things. But the movie Braveheart, which is very historically inaccurate, by the way, with Mel Gibson playing William Wallace. William Wallace was a real person, but what happened? They mix up all the details. Suffice to say that the Scottish never give up, and in the end, the English do give up. And Scotland remains. This is very important to British culture because there won't be a United Kingdom of Great Britain unless Scotland remains free. So Scotland the Brave, Scotland the Free continues until 1707 when they vote to make a union. Like voluntarily, and it's a complicated situation, but Scotland and England form a partnership, which is the United Kingdom of Great Britain, right? The Union Jack is the symbol of the combination of the flags, the crosses of Scotland, Ireland, and England. That's what the Union Jack is. That's this cultural symbol that everybody knows. It is about a union, not about conquering. So they failed to conquer Scotland. Part of the reason is because the Great Famine is in the middle of it. And it's pretty hard to fight a war when you have nothing to eat. So they fail. They recover. They're starting to recover from the famine. But as I told you, it causes a lot of health problems and a lot of people die. The population starts to drop instead of increasing. It's somewhere around 6 million people. And after this century, half of those people are going to disappear. The population's not going to recover for hundreds of years. Half of the population is going to vanish because of the famine and the subsequent waves of the Black Death. So between these two events, you can see 1337, and if you play video games, the way I remember this is 1337 is a LEET, which means, right? If you ever see somebody write this in a video game in English, this means elite. That number is a famous number in video games because if you say somebody is 1337, it means elite, which means that person's really good. That's how I always have a little kind of trick in my head to remember everything. And I just remember, that's wrong, excuse me, 1453, simply because there's another huge event that happens at the same time, so it's easy to remember. So for the entire time, remember this, for everything I tell you today, from this point, from 1337, from the leet year, there's a war going on, off and on. It's not a war like, unfortunately, what's going on in Ukraine right now, where it's every day there's fighting. This is like a medieval war. So they fight, then they have a battle, and then the war continues, but nothing happens for 5 years. And then they have another battle, and then they have another battle, like 3 months in a row. They have, big battles, and there's a big change, and then 10 years goes by and there's just small fighting, there's small fights everywhere, and they're not trading, and they're capturing and burning things, and generally hating each other, but there's not actual killing and big battles happening the whole time. Otherwise, those countries would both have disappeared. You can't have, battles, constant battles for 100 years. And as you can see, it's actually more than 100 years. It's more like 116 years. So they call it the 100 Years' War, but it's really not. It's more like, there's 2 breaks. So there's 3 periods of war. But if you really want to get down to it, it's more like 7 or 8 different wars, because there's different kings. Like 116 years, you've got like 5 different kings in charge. And the first one is Edward III, but it's going to go all the way to Henry V. And some of the kings are going to be good warriors and some of them are not, right? So the 100 Years' War is going on in the background. And that's all I want to say about that, is that from the connection between France and England that is formed by William the Conqueror, who has lands on both sides, and then the fact that Henry II adds to it by marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine, and his father is Geoffrey of Anjou, so they gather even more land. The King of France wants that land. There's like a 30% of France belongs to England. So they get it back. They get it back from King John, but Edward, then they have a similar thing happen. The King of France dies and he doesn't have a son. And Edward III is related by his mother, through his mother, he's related to the King of France. So Edward III says, I'm the King of France, so give me my land back. And they say, of course not, we can't do that. You can only inherit the crown through the male line. And they say this goes back, it's Salic law. The French say, goes right back to the people with these mustaches. You notice I have this mustache? This is grown especially for this class and for my PhD classes, because eventually Victorians will have mustaches. So I'm gonna grow this. In person, you won't be able to see it because of the mask, but I'm growing this mustache to make a Frankish Victorian mustache. The Franks, the people that were around at the time of Alfred, and the Anglo-Saxons, Charlemagne, the Carolingians, the Merovingians, these people, these French ancestors of the French, they often had these handlebar mustaches like me. And I'm not a Frank, I'm an Anglo-Saxon, as they would say. We don't use that term anymore, but I'm descended from British stock. So there's some of my ancestors could have been Franks. So there's my mustache. Those people only allowed, they said, the French administration, the French government said, we can only have kings that are descended by male lines, and we're not going to have any queens. So Edward III, sorry, you can't be, because that would be a horrible thing, that the King of France was the King of England. They didn't want that. They wanted to be distinct. This is one of the reasons that English culture becomes stronger and stronger, and French culture becomes stronger and stronger, because in some ways, French historians point out that by fighting the English, the French defined who they were. Who are we? We're not English. And like this unified a country that was really divided. There's Burgundy, and there's Orleans, and there's, like I said, Poitou, Brittany, Anjou, Normandy. There's all these regions of Provence. There's all these regions of France. They don't consider themselves one country. They have one king, but the regions are very, very, not unified. Unlike England, right? England still has its regions, but England has been unified, especially, from the fighting the Vikings. They fought the Vikings, and they were a unified kingdom. And then the whole kingdom was taken over by William, but it's a nation. And that's why some people consider England the first nation, because they perceived themselves as one people, right? And the Normans were invaders. They were foreigners. But soon after, by the time they start fighting in 1337, 200 years later, the Normans don't consider themselves foreigners. They consider themselves English. They're not calling themselves Normans anymore. And during the 100 Years' War, they will finally, the kings of England will start speaking English. So by the end, by 1453, you have France and England. And England speaking English, and the French are speaking French, the way we expect it to be. But at the beginning of this, Edward III is speaking French still. He's fighting to get his land. He thinks that France belongs to him. By the end, it's clear that the French king is in control of France, and that's his people. And the English king is not a Norman. He's not a Frenchman. He's not a French. He's an English king. Henry V, the last one to almost take over France, and the Joan of Arc thing prevents that from happening. He will be speaking English. He will be. It's this period that English law, the English king, English records will begin. The Parliament will be opened in English. This is in the book. You can look at it. So it's in this period, in the 14th century, with all this stuff fighting, and the English start defining themselves as English, and the kings become, even though their ancestors spoke French, Richard the Lionheart and William the Conqueror couldn't speak English. Richard could speak some English, but William couldn't speak English. The English kings stopped speaking French as the first language, and soon they won't even be able to speak French at all, right? Eventually. Some of the kings and queens will study French and be able to speak French and understand French and Latin and Italian and Spanish as well. But they're native speaking English speakers. They're native English speakers, and they will not speak French fluently. They won't speak French like a native Frenchman. But at the beginning of the 100 Years' War, they are. The court is still talking French. They're still doing parliament in French. Through this conflict, both countries will become more unified. And, people often say France doesn't really become a completely nationalistic place until Napoleon. So even though France kind of gets this kingdom unification project well on its way by 1453, it'll still be very regionally oriented all the way up to arguably the 19th century. Whereas England, even before they fight France, is already distinctly unified and an English-dominated culture. Just the elite on the top haven't been converted. In the process of the 100 Years' War, they will be. Right after they start, 10 years after they start, Edward III goes and starts winning all kinds of battles, and the French are in big trouble. They don't have good leadership, and even though they have more territory, they have more money, they have more soldiers, and they're fighting on home turf. They're on their own land, which usually adds power to your defense and your ability to fight. They are getting they're repeatedly defeated. Is what I'm trying to say. So he's making rapid progress, and he takes back all of the land that belonged to his ancestors, to Henry II, and more. Right. So France is losing, and they're losing badly. And then the Black Death comes out, and they can't really fight very much again while everybody's dying. So let's talk about the Black Death. What's the effect of the Black Death? Well, you should read about it. It's in the book. Of course, the main negative thing is the death. The Black Death is a plague that comes on fleas, and the fleas are carried on rats, and the rats are carried by cargo ships and by overland by human beings, and the Mongolians supposedly, or a tribe of Mongolian related steppe people. They may not specifically have been Mongolians, Tatars anyway. They attack Sevastopol, the Black Sea, and the Italian ships there bring the disease back to Italy, and through Italy, which is sort of like the trade outpost that connects Europe to Asia and Africa and the Middle East. They're the ones that are making all the money. They go through the Italian Renaissance. Before this happens, they have rich city-states like Venice and Genoa, and that's how the disease ends up in those really dense cities that are connected to all over the Mediterranean, and from there it spreads all over the place. And so, in 1345, 1346, it starts to arrive, and it doesn't get to England until 1348. When it gets there, it disrupts trade, it disrupts travel, it disrupts the church. One of the biggest things I said is what happens is most of the priests who are doing, one of the responsibilities of the church is to do funerals and comfort people who are dying. They don't really want to do that because then they're going to get the plague. So like when you're dying of the Black Death, the priest is supposed to bless you and pray for you so that you can go to heaven, and you can do your confessions so that you can rest in peace, right? As we say, R.I.P., rest in peace. But people are very religious, and they believe that if they don't see a priest and they don't they don't ask for forgiveness and confess, and they don't get their last rites, especially wealthy people believe that their soul will not rest in peace. So a lot of the priests do what they're supposed to do, and a lot of them die. And the other priests don't do it because they don't want to die. So you can see how, the quality, many of the dedicated priests that try and help the people and do what they normally do, because as I said, the center of the town is based on the church. So there's an abbey, there's a cathedral if it's a big town. England's really a lot of towns. There's not really any real cities, just London. London's the only real city. But there are cathedral towns, which are bigger. They're nothing compared to the cities we have now. Neither was London, but London was the only one that had a real city feel. So you have these market towns, and you have these small churches, and then you have cathedral towns that basically those are the wealthier, bigger towns. Those would have bishops. Canterbury has an archbishop, and York is the biggest small city or big town outside of England. It's northern England has an archbishopric as well, so there's two archbishops. All of these people are supposed to be managing all religious affairs, which touches every part of community life. As I said, it's related to education and social assistance and marriage and criminal behavior. The church has its own court, and there's an economic aspect because the church has a lot of land. So they grow things and they sell things and they make things. All of these things are related to the church. And when you have good, well-trained priests and monks and abbots, bishops, that's the system works well. But when all of them die and they need to be replaced quickly, you end up with much younger clergymen. You end up with, rather than having let's say, 30-year-old or 35-year-old, or if it's a bishop, maybe a 40, 45-year-old man. And in the case of nuns or an abbess, there would be women that are educated for a long time, and they know their Latin, and they know the Bible, and they know their role, and they've been trained how to do their job. You have all these young people who are not trained well, not educated as well, and not doing their job properly. So the church goes through a crisis at the same time as the Black Death, because basically everything goes through a crisis, because you can imagine if 30% of the workforce just disappeared, you wouldn't get any of your packages from Coupang anymore, right? Because even with coronavirus, there's a lot of delays. Sometimes deliveries don't happen. Sometimes things are stuck at the warehouse. I ordered some books this year and last year, and it takes a month for a book to get to your house if there's a backup because there's half the staff in the warehouse and half the delivery workers are in quarantine because they have Omicron, right? But in this case, it's worse because it's not like half of them are sick and then 1 week later they're going to come back and start working again. In the case of the Black Death, they're dead. So the entire, if you have 2 blacksmiths in the town and one of them dies, then you only have 1 blacksmith for the entire population. If you only have 1 blacksmith in the town and he dies, then you have 0 and you have nobody to train. You have nobody to train another blacksmith. So how are you going to get, shoes on your horses or fix hammers or make chains or anything for farming? So there's entire areas of England that just kind of get abandoned, right? It happens in 1066, after 1066, about 7 or 8 years later, when William the Conqueror goes and burns and kills all these people in northern England. There's just not enough of them, to maintain the village life or the town life. So it gets abandoned. They move and they form new towns, or like the people move from the damaged, destroyed town or empty town to another one. And this is what happens in the Black Death. The forest starts to regrow, and farmland that needs to be worked and tilled doesn't get worked. They don't have anybody to plant. They don't have anybody to pull the weeds or cut down the trees. So, when millions of people disappear in a country that only has 6 million people, all of this land just sits there, and the forest of England expands. It gets overgrown, and some of these villages you can find these abandoned places. Now, of course, it's we've built over a lot of these places, but underneath there are the remains of abandoned towns all over England and all over Europe from this disaster. Now, let me talk about a weird side effect of the Black Death, because the Black Death is probably the most important thing that happened in the last 1,000 years to England. There's the Norman Conquest. Okay, you can say that's culturally significant in particular ways, but long term, the Black Death is going to transform all of Europe in a way, especially England, in a way that even having a country conquered and sort of colonized wouldn't do. And that's because there's so many people that are gone that the power shifts away from the wealthy people to the people that remain. And that's because if you think about it, if you're a wealthy person and you need your land is your main source of money, and you need workers to work, and half of them die, then the rest of them have to do more work and they can demand more pay, right? That's basically the law of supply and demand. There's a lower supply of workers. There's not enough workers. So those remaining workers naturally get paid more, and they would have been obligated to stay on their own land with the landlord. But if the landlord dies, they can go somewhere else, right? If half the family of the landlord dies, or the person that they're beholden to, and there's no son and there's nobody in the castle, then you don't have to stay there anymore because there's nobody there to stop you. So it disrupts the entire system. And that's why the title of chapter 2 is the Great Chain of Being. And they're going to continue to talk about this. This is going to be a huge issue in the background again. Long after this period is over, Shakespeare is going to still be talking about this, that there's an order in human beings, in society. There's an order. There's the God at the top and rocks at the bottom, right? Inanimate objects. It's an Aristotelian, it's Aristotle's concept of the order of the composition and order of the living things. Non-living things are at the very bottom. God is at the top. I mean, Aristotle doesn't mention God, but this is adapted to it's a Christian model based on Aristotle's idea of the classification of organisms. So at the top, you got humans, and you got monkeys and dogs and smart animals. all the way down to, plants, broccoli, carrots, water, rocks at the bottom, okay? So things that are intelligent and things that have souls. We believe human beings have, well, you may or may not believe, but they believed, Christians believed, and still do, that you have a soul, and maybe animals don't. Do they have souls? That's for philosophy class. We won't talk about that. But we're above the animals, and above us are angels and God. And within human beings, there's also an order. Notice it's a chain, not a ladder. You can't move up and down. If you're born a king, you're born a prince, you're supposed to be there. You're not supposed to go down to a peasant. If you're a peasant, you're born a peasant, you're not supposed to go up in the chain. Everybody has their place. This is medieval order. This is the way life, the church, and the state, the kingdom is supposed to be arranged. And Shakespeare will use this idea and criticize it, but also promote it at the same time in his plays hundreds of years later, because they're still struggling with it. Like, why should we follow this person just because they're born? Well, because of the chain of being. God has organized life this way. So, dukes are dukes, barons are barons, townspeople and tradespeople are at that level, and peasants and serfs and slaves are at the bottom, and that's where they belong. Don't mess with the system. But the Black Death messes with the system pretty seriously, because it punches holes and breaks the chain, because there's just not people there's gaps in the levels, so it leaves mobility open. It means that people can go up and down much easier, and they're afraid of this. So they try to restrict it, but in the end there's a benefit. The people at the bottom are more valuable, so they have to get more pay, and they should be able to move around, physically move from one town to another to find work, which you were not allowed to do really before the Black Death. You had to stay within your region, and you had to work for the person, just like your parents did and their ancestors. Peasants were peasants, slaves were slaves, and it wasn't very easy to get out of that, that position that you're born into. But the Black Death disrupts all this, kills a lot of people, so that there's a strange positive side effect for the people who are remaining. And that's why there's a revolt in in year 1381. At the end of the century, there's a revolt because the wealthy people, especially the king, Richard II, because he comes after Edward III when he dies, because Edward III's son, who is also an Edward, but we'll call him the Black Prince because that was his nickname. The Black Prince dies before his father. So it skips him because he dies, and it goes to, the crown goes to his grandson, Edward III's grandson, and his name is Richard. And he becomes, when his grandfather dies, Edward III dies after the Black Prince, he becomes Richard II, and he's still a boy, okay? Now, he has uncles, and this is a really important, another really important king that needs to be discussed and explained. And I know I've mentioned a lot of Henrys and a lot of Edwards already, and there's more Henrys and Edwards to come. So you do have to be careful. I'm not going to ask you too much about Edward III, so you don't need to memorize that. Anything that I don't put on the board specifically, you don't need to memorize, but you need to know, who is who and what's important about them. So what's important about Richard is that he is a boy. He's a boy king, and that's never a good thing. Having a boy king is never a good thing, especially when your grandfather was Edward III, who was a famous warrior king, and he was like a King Arthur. He was dashing, tall, handsome, strong, decisive, lived for a long time. He's the perfect medieval king. He's exactly the model of Richard the Lionheart, and his grandfather Edward I was like that too. Edward II was not. He was a weak, kind of not interested in war kind of person. Richard II is a boy, so he can't be the warrior king. and he never becomes that anyway, but he's still a boy. He's like 12 years old. So he's not going to be the type of king that is going to inspire the country, and he's not going to be able to fight the 100 Years' War. He's not going to be able to lead it. His father was the Black Prince. His nickname was the Black Prince because he wore black armor. And the grandfather, Edward III, and the Black Prince won battles separately. They were both in France, beating French armies separately at the same time. The family is like, this is the height of English power and their ability to make war and to dominate France. It gets to the point where it looks like the French are going to lose the whole country. And then they make peace and they give back, Edward III, they give back the parts that they lost, earlier, 50 years earlier, all the lands that were lost by King John, the bad king, they get them all back. But then the Black Prince dies, and then Edward III dies, and we're left with a boy king who grows up to be a bad king anyway. That's why the peasants revolt. They're being overtaxed, they're trying to fight a war, and they're losing. Because he's not really a good leader. He's a boy. He's being basically controlled by his uncles, his uncles are the Black Prince's brothers. And Richard II is also a Shakespeare play. This is a period when a lot of the history is well known. Shakespeare will write a lot of history about, I think he has 12 history plays. He will write about Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, and he'll write about Richard II and Richard III. Okay, so this is the beginning of an era that is kind of famous, almost like a fantasy, history, formation of medieval English, the inheritance of the English knights and honor and fighting and prowess. This is where it comes from. So this is a really disturbing event. It's related to the Black Death because the peasants are feeling like what they've gotten as a result. Higher wages, the ability to move around, more recognition, more power, and more value is being restricted again. The government, Richard II's uncles, and the government are trying to increase taxes, and they're trying to reduce wages and make it so that the peasants have to stay on their land and they can't leave. They can't shop around for better work. They have to work for one employer. Okay? This is kind of like, this is like a really violent protest. It's like there's unrest and there's protesting first, but then it explodes into this event, which almost ends up overthrowing the government, almost overthrows the king. Now, like I said, I tried to make it shorter and sweeter, but I failed. So we're gonna stop here. I'll pick it up. I'll talk about the Peasants' Revolt. You got to read this stuff. It's in the book. Let me just point out chapter 2, right? It's called Unsettling the Chain of Being. I just explained about the chain of being there. You need to, basically, we're through most of the chapter, except for, I talked about emerging English and the English Unleashed. I haven't done page 79. So if you read over the rest of the chapter, before I talk next lecture on Wednesday, there's the English Unleashed there, and there should be, I skipped over basically on page 76, I skipped over Chaucer, which I have to, and Wycliffe. So I basically have to cover page 75 to page 75. But the rest of the chapter I've done. So page 75 to 79, I'm going to cover that material, which is the Peasants' Revolt, and two important individuals, Chaucer and Wycliffe, John Wycliffe. Okay? Everything else here is done. And so if you read the whole chapter, you can read about Chaucer and Wycliffe. It's just one page on Chaucer, or 1.5 pages on Chaucer and like 1 page on Wycliffe, and read about the Peasants' Revolt, and I will explain it in more detail. And that lecture will be shorter for sure, because we just have these 3 things: the 2 guys, the Peasants' Revolt, and this is just a number. We're not going to talk about the fall of Constantinople. Only it's often used. 1453 is the end of the 100 Years' War. It's the end of the war between France and England. France wins, and at the same time in the East, Constantinople falls. It's sort of the back end of the results of the Crusades. Instead, the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, will take over Constantinople. Eventually, they will call it Istanbul. Its name will be changed to Istanbul hundreds of years later, but they will take over Constantinople, and from there they will invade Europe in a turning of the tables, so to speak. The Christians went down and took over the Middle East, which was controlled by the Muslims, and now the Ottoman Empire, not to get revenge, just because they are a powerful, expanding military at the time, and Europe is weak. And so they end up, in the 100 years after that, they end up expanding all the way to Austria. They make it all the way to Vienna, in a sort of reversal of the Crusader era, and eventually their control will recede back, to the edge of Turkey and the edge of Greece, where this is sort of the natural border between Asia and Europe. So that's not in the course. It just happens to be the same year that the Byzantine Empire finally collapses. The Eastern Roman Empire finally collapses after 1,000 years, and the Ottoman Muslim armies take it over. And in the West, England loses to France, and they lose all of their lands in France except for one small city called Calais, which they will hold on to for another 100 years, but it's really not very meaningful. Okay, so that's it. That was another long lecture, but I promise you the next one will be only about 30 minutes, because we just have to deal with the Peasants' Revolt and how that goes and why it's important, Chaucer and Wycliffe, and then, medieval times stuff will be over, and that'll be all the material for the quiz. And after that, we'll be moving on to early modern Renaissance England, something that's probably more familiar to you. So this is the next lecture will be the end of the sort of historical background of British culture. Okay? Thank you for listening. I hope some of the things I said were entertaining and informative to you. So now you can understand the background for, how the relationship between the king and the people starts to change, so that we're eventually going to end up with the modern state of the United Kingdom. Thank you for listening, and take care of yourself. Remember, we're going to continue online for a couple more weeks, just to wait until things are a little bit more stable, and then our Friday lectures will start. But next Friday, online, and another quiz, just like you did the first one. Most of you did it very well, and hopefully your experience will allow you to get a better grade. So please listen to this lecture by next Friday, and take your notes for the last 2 weeks, and prepare yourself. Next Friday will be quiz number 2. Thank you. Have a good day. Enjoy your weekend.